Who invented cooking? Have you ever sat around and thought about this? Or even just where did chefs come from? Most culinarians give credit to two main characters, with a few others sprinkled in, as sort of the chef canon, if you will, for what we know today as modern cuisine. You know my pronunciations are absolute garbage, but I'm going to give it a go. Sound good? Let's learn. Now, cooking is as old as civilization itself, and it's considered to be as much about science as it is art. Now, we do know once fire came on the scene, cooking was obviously made possible. Some of the early methods of cooking would have been roasting over an open flame by adhering meat, which could have been fish, rabbit, whatever it is, right to a stick and then holding it over a fire. In addition, to preserve and flavor the meat, it would have been smoked, which today we know as jerky. Amazing. Now, from there, it eventually began to evolve to food wrapped in leaves and cooked over hot coals to sort of steam roast what was inside to make food more tender and, of course, a lot more delicious. Then, as clay pots began to develop, enter in the wonderful world of boiling and frying. Thank you. Now, I always said soup was my first love, and there's nothing, and I mean nothing, like a huge pot or cauldron of soup or stew over an open fire. Let's go. Now, fast forward a few centuries, and chefs started to come on the scene. And in ancient Greece, which was 800 BC to about 146 BC, and most of them were slaves, and often the master of the slaves and servants who worked closely in that working environment. And as Roman influence began to take over around 31 BC, the chef then started to move up in social status, and at this point, were started to be seen as an important tradesman in society. Rome is where this professional status in society of cooks was established. And then moving along, this is probably one of my favorite things, the De Re Coquinaria by Apicius, which means on the subject of cooking, came about and was the first known cookbook ever recorded. This was a collection of early Roman dishes and recipes that were said to have been compiled during the 5th century. Now, to me, that's just fascinating history of food really starting to take shape. I'll, of course, drop a link in the description if you want to pick it up. No, there are no measurements at all in this book. I've seen it. Then during the Middle Ages or medieval era, between the 400s and 1500 AD, is when technological advances emerged with the introduction of the oven, stoves, different pots and pans, cooking utensils, you name it. Cooking just got a whole lot easier, and different cooking methods, ingredients, and cuisines were being developed. Feasts and banquets were starting to take off during this time period as well. Huge hat tip though to Africa, India, and China for the trading of spices, which started the introduction of international cuisine as people were being exposed to new ingredients, foods, and flavors. During the Renaissance period, which is in between the 14th and 17th century, is when the chef started to harbor notoriety as a person of influence, and Italy had the best, most famous chefs in the world. They elevated cooking and fine dining to the next level with their creativity and skills. And at this time is when menus were starting to be shown to guests at feasts and banquets. Which, cool enough, some are actually still around to today. Pastas, breads, cakes, flan, citrus, and so much more became popularized during these centuries. Now, an important, more famous story during this time was that Italian cooking concepts were introduced to France through the marriage of Caterina de' Medici, who was from Florence, Italy, and Henry II from France. Supposedly, Medici, who was the Queen of France after marrying Henry from 1547 to 1559, brought her famous chefs with her, and from there, France became more sophisticated and highly regarded in the food world. But with all the credit to Italian cuisine. Now, however, as of late, historians have been pushing back on this story because they state French cooking didn't modernize for at least another 100 years after Medici was Queen of France. And during the century after Medici, there were no new written cookbooks or new signs of any sort of cooking revolution that should have taken place from these Italian chefs and influence on French cuisine. There are actually banquet menus that survived that period and show no difference at all to those menus of the Middle Ages, which signal to scholars that maybe, just maybe, the original story of Italian cuisine didn't influence French cuisine as suspected. Hey, do not shoot the messenger. However, after the Renaissance era is when France really steps into the cooking game. The first modernized restaurant is established in Paris in 1765 and is called boulanger, which only serves soups. Now in 1765 is also when the term restaurant or restoratives came into play. The word literally means fortifying. Now, food production in France was maintained by guilds, so caterers, pastry makers, roasters, or butchers had to have licenses to prepare specific foods. You couldn't just serve guests without these licenses. Super annoying. At the boulanger, they were serving a dish of sheep's feet in a cream sauce, and the Guild of Stew Makers found out, and they took the restaurant to court claiming the sheep's feet were stewed in the sauce and not separately, and that the boulanger did not have a license for that. Well, the boulanger won the court case and forever changed the history of food service. Now, after the monarchy fell in France due to the French Revolution, the guilds were abolished, and the chefs that were employed by serving the noble families were suddenly out of work. So they started to open restaurants in Paris to support themselves and their families. This opened the door to food being served just about anywhere without the need of licensed professionals. Restaurant kitchens at this time were split into 3 divisions. The chef in charge of cooking meat, who was known as the rôtisseur or rotisserie, the patisserie, better known as the pastry chef, who ran the ovens, and then finally the cuisine, who cooked directly on the stove. Now, all of these chefs reported to the chef de cuisine or head of the kitchen. At this point, there was officially a difference between home cooking and professional cooking. Important point in history. Now, during this time period, we get the introduction of the first of 2 people most accredited with modern cuisine, Marie-Antoine Carême. He was famous for being the chef to the stars and elite families of Europe and considered to be the first celebrity chef. He devoted his life to learning all the intricacies of cooking, refining and organizing culinary techniques. He has written multiple books that display fundamental principles, recipes, and how to make menus. And of course, let's not forget the creator of the 5 mother sauces, Espagnole, sauce tomate, velouté, bechamel, and hollandaise. He made extravagant sugar sculptures, ice and tallow carvings, showpieces, pastries, and wedding cakes. And most notable was his practical and theoretical work as the author-inventor of recipes that are credited for moving cuisine from the Middle Ages to the modern era. I'll post some links to a few of his books in the description. His attention was put on procedures and order with the intent to develop simplicity within cooking and tried to lighten the process. Carême is also acknowledged with adding seasonings and ingredients to accentuate the flavors of the main components of the dish. His goal in doing this was to enhance, not alter. He wanted the sauces to complement, not mask. Whenever he looked to change a classical recipe, he always explained his reasonings for doing so. His style of cooking spread throughout the world, and his fundamental principles of cooking are still used today by professionals. And one of my favorite things about him is that he experimented with cooking procedures and pushed to achieve the best result through different cooking methods and techniques. Carême will forever be a legend in the history of cuisine. But not to be undone by the greatest chef of his time and the man who seems to get all the fame, Georges Auguste Escoffier. He's considered as the father of 20th century cookery. He worked to simplify classical cuisine and menus even more than Carême and reorganized the kitchen into a military-style brigade system after his short gig as an army chef. His goal was to have a chain of command in the kitchen headed by the executive chef who supervised workers with specific areas of expertise. The pastry chef, the roasting chef, the saucier or sauté chef, the garde-manger chef of cold foods, the entremetier or chef of hot vegetables, the poissonnier or fish chef, the grillardin or grill chef, the fruitrier or fry chef, the boucher or butchering chef, the tournant or relief chef, all were under the guise of the exec and all had training chefs underneath them known as commis. Sound familiar? He essentially streamlined the workplace, making it more suitable for cranking out tasty dishes without chaos or duplication of effort, resulting in workers now knowing and understanding their clear-cut responsibilities. And as a side note, the pastry chef also had 4 different positions of specialization, and I'm going to butcher these. Confiseur, that makes candies and petitfours. Boulanger, which makes sweetened doughs for breads and rolls. Glaceur, that makes frozen and cold desserts, think ice cream. decorateur who prepares sugar showpieces or specialty cakes. Now, since there is a long-standing war between the back of the house or kitchen staff and front of the house or wait staff, I'll have to save those position descriptions for another video. Yes, the kitchen is indeed the backbone of all restaurants, but I'm just being biased or trolling. I don't know, you decide. Now, Escoffier worked to eliminate any general confusion in cooking and created order on menus where there were only 1 or 2 dishes per course instead of a huge table filled with different foods. He worked to create an easy-to-follow meal of courses that easily followed one another and noted for being simple and delicious. All of the basic cooking principles that we learned and put into practice today can be chalked up to Escoffier's work. He has written several books, yes, I'll pop links to those in the description, that are still widely used by chefs and professional cooks. He said, and I love this, classical cooking begins with learning a relatively few basic procedures and understanding basic ingredients. This is the stuff I preach to you all the time. Some other notable chefs who can absolutely be given a standing ovation to. Now, really quick, if you're French, I highly recommend you either mute the video or turn it off, because I'm going to murder these names. All right. Chef Antelme Bria-Savarin. I can't even do it. Savarin. How do I say it? Chef Antelme Bria-Savarin, who wrote The Physiology of Taste. Francois Pierre, much easier, who wrote La Varenne's Cookery, and Bartolomeo Scappi, who wrote Opera dell'arte del Cucinare. Francois Marin, that's pretty easy, who wrote Les Dons de Comos. Nicolas de Bonfons, who wrote Les Délices de la Campagne. Gosh, that is brutal. Joseph Manon, who wrote numerous books on food and cooking science, and then Francois Massaillo, who wrote Les Cuisines Royales des Bourgeois, among a few more. That was brutal. My apologies. All right. The one thing, however, that always stands out to me in the plainest terms possible is while cooking has been around for forever, I have to credit these French chefs with putting pen to paper and creating the terminology to the gestures and techniques of cooking. Things like how to properly saute, or precise knife cuts, or even just how to braise. These are the basic fundamental principles of cuisine that we still use today. Every culinary school on earth teaches these French techniques from these founding fathers of modern cookery. If you just look at some of the best chefs in the world, or hey, if you just happen to see the show Chef's Table on Netflix, what do so many of these famous chefs of restaurants have in common? No matter what country they're from, most of them go to Paris to culinary school to learn these basic principles of cooking, then they return to their country of origin and apply all these methods and techniques to their indigenous cuisine to make seriously incredible food. I mean, all of these chefs doing that just speaks for itself. Now, this is how it all came to be, but the coolest part is cooking continues to evolve and new techniques are coming on the scene and getting tested. The bad ones, or just okay ones, will weed themselves out. But the good ones that prove to produce amazing results will continue on in the books. Happy cooking, y'all.